The CNN primetime special, examining congressional oversight authority and its constitutional foundations, had been structured as what network producers characterized as Anderson Cooper 360's signature deep dive format, featuring Cooper's renowned interviewing style that distinguished CNN's coverage through his combination of journalistic rigor, emotional intelligence, and ability to ask probing questions without descending into theatrical confrontation that characterized less substantive cable news programming. With a special explicitly designed to provide CNN's sophisticated audience with comprehensive examination of separation of powers questions that dominated headlines but that typical news coverage reduced to partisan talking points, rather than exploring constitutional complexity that serious journalism required addressing. Anderson Cooper sat across from his guest with evident intellectual engagement that had made him one of television journalism's most respected figures. His background reporting from conflict zones and disaster areas having given him perspective on governmental accountability questions that transcended partisan positioning, and his interviewing approach, combining genuine curiosity with rigorous follow-up, creating an environment where substantive dialogue could emerge when guests possessed expertise, warranting serious examination rather than superficial soundbite exchanges. Jasmine Crockett had been invited, specifically for extended CNN special because Cooper and his producers believed her demonstrated constitutional sophistication in previous media appearances suggested capacity for substantive discussion that would serve CNN audience seeking intelligent analysis rather than predictable partisan advocacy, with network executives viewing the interview as opportunity to showcase both Cooper's interviewing excellence and congressional members' ability to engage with complex questions in ways that would elevate political discourse beyond typical cable news limitations. The interview had been proceeding through examination of congressional investigatory authority when Anderson Cooper had begun what experienced CNN viewers recognized as one of his signature testing sequences, a series of increasingly precise and detailed questions designed not to embarrass guests but rather to determine whether their public positions reflected genuine expertise or superficial talking points. His testing clearly motivated by journalistic commitment to distinguishing between politicians who could discuss constitutional questions with real sophistication and those who relied on prepared statements without deeper understanding. Then Anderson Cooper had posed what was clearly the culmination of his testing sequence, a question so specific in its incorporation of constitutional text, Supreme Court precedent, separation of powers theory, and practical governance considerations that it would require extraordinary precision to answer comprehensively. Delivered without hostility but with evident expectation that the question's complexity would reveal whether Crockett's constitutional understanding was as sophisticated as her previous answers had suggested, or whether she would struggle when pushed beyond prepared talking points into territory requiring genuine constitutional expertise. His question clearly designed as professional test of whether congressional member could engage at levels CNN's serious journalism demanded, or whether the interview should shift to more accessible but less substantive terrain. What Anderson Cooper could not have anticipated was that Crockett would respond not just adequately, but with precision so exceptional. In its comprehensive analysis of every element, his question incorporated so sophisticated in its synthesis of doctrinal strands that Cooper's question had deliberately combined to test her command of constitutional complexity, and so unexpected in its demonstration that her constitutional understanding exceeded what even Cooper's demanding test had been designed to measure, that her response would visibly stun Cooper and would leave CNN's control room, whose reactions could be heard off-camera, impressed by witnessing congressional testimony achieving level of constitutional sophistication that CNN's most demanding interviewer had tested for but apparently hadn't expected to encounter at quite this level of excellence. If you want to see what happens when television journalism's most respected interviewer tests congressional member with question designed to measure genuine constitutional expertise, and that member responds with precision so exceptional that it stuns the interviewer, the network, and the audience by demonstrating command of constitutional doctrine that exceeds what the demanding test was designed to measure. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because we are going to examine every element of how Crockett's precision stunned CNN Live and Why. This moment became legendary for demonstrating that some congressional members possess constitutional expertise that can astonish even the most sophisticated journalists when rigorous testing reveals intellectual depth that typical political discourse rarely surfaces. Cooper's test of Crockett had come approximately 40 minutes into the CNN special after extensive discussion about congressional authority had established that she could engage substantively with constitutional questions. Cooper had then shifted to what was clearly his design test of whether that engagement reflected deep expertise. Cooper had begun Representative Crockett. I want to pose a question that incorporates multiple constitutional considerations simultaneously, because I think examining how you synthesize these different elements will help our audience understand the sophistication, or lack thereof, congressional thinking about oversight authority. His tone was professional and respectful, making clear this was serious test rather than gotcha attempt. Cooper had continued, "The Constitution's text gives Congress all legislative powers, but doesn't explicitly enumerate investigatory authority. The Supreme Court in McGrain v. Dougherty held that investigatory power is implied as necessary to legislative function. But later cases like Watkins v. United States and Trump v. Mazars have established that investigations must serve legitimate legislative purposes and can't be unlimited fishing expeditions." The CNN studio had been completely focused, with Cooper's detailed question setup making clear he was building towards something demanding. Cooper had then posed his comprehensive test. So here's what I want you to address. How do we reconcile the broad implied investigatory authority that McGrain recognized with the limiting principles that Watkins and Mazars established, particularly when we're dealing with investigations of executive officials who claim privilege? What's the constitutional framework that synthesizes text, precedent, separation of powers, considerations, and practical governance needs? And can you articulate that framework with sufficient precision that it would actually guide courts and Congress in resolving specific disputes rather than just providing general principles that everyone interprets differently? The question had been delivered with evident seriousness, clearly designed to test whether Crockett could provide sophisticated constitutional analysis rather than general platitudes about oversight. But what happened next would stun Anderson Cooper, and everyone watching CNN had paused briefly to organize her response, then had begun speaking with analytical precision that immediately demonstrated this was no ordinary congressional testimony. Crockett had responded, "Anderson, thank you for that question, because it requires me to synthesize multiple doctrinal strands into coherent framework, which is exactly what constitutional analysis should do. Let me address each element you raised, and then provide the synthesis you asked for." She had pulled out materials first. The textual foundation. Article 1 grants Congress all legislative powers. The word all is significant, comprehensive, rather than limited enumeration. McGrain held that investigatory power is implied from this grant because, as the court stated, a legislative body cannot legislate wisely or effectively in the absence of information. That's not just judicial interpretation, it's recognition of what all legislative powers must include to be meaningful. Cooper had been taking extensive notes. Clearly impressed by the precision of her opening, Crockett had continued. Second, the limiting principles from Watkins and Mazars. Watkins held that investigations must be pertinent to valid legislative purpose. Congress can't investigate for exposure's sake without connection to potential legislation. Mazars added that, when investigating coordinate branch, courts should consider 1. Whether the asserted legislative purpose is valid. 2. Whether the subpoena advances that purpose. 3. Whether Congress demonstrated need for the information. And 4. Whether compliance would unduly burden the presidency. But Anderson, here's the crucial synthesis you asked for. These limiting principles don't contradict McGrain's broad authority. They specify how to apply it in contexts involving constitutional tensions. The framework is broad authority, constrained by specific doctrinal requirements rather than limited authority with exceptions. She had then delivered what would stun CNN. The constitutional framework that synthesizes all these elements works like this. Congress has broad implied investigatory authority derived from Article I's grant of legislative powers. That authority is limited by three categories of constitutional constraints. First, enumeration limits Congress can only investigate subjects within its legislative jurisdiction. It can't investigate purely state matters or purely private conduct outside federal legislative authority. Second, individual rights limits investigations can't violate Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, First Amendment, or other constitutional rights that protect individuals from governmental intrusion. Third, separation of powers limits when investigating coordinate branches. Congress must demonstrate that investigation serves legitimate legislative purpose, that the specific information sought advances that purpose, and that the need outweighs any valid privilege claims or institutional disruption. Cooper had stopped taking notes and was simply listening. Visibly impressed, Crockett had continued. This framework guides specific disputes by establishing analytical sequence. Courts first ask whether investigation falls within Congress's legislative jurisdiction. If yes, courts then ask whether individual constitutional rights are violated. If no rights violation, courts finally ask whether separation of powers concerns require balancing congressional need against executive interests. That's not general principle everyone interprets differently. That specific analytical framework that produces determinate outcomes when applied to actual disputes. And Anderson, I can demonstrate this by applying the framework to hypotheticals. If you'd like me to show how it works in practice. Cooper had responded with visible astonishment. Representative Crockett, that's one of the most sophisticated constitutional frameworks I've heard articulated by anyone on this program, including constitutional law professors. You've synthesized text, precedent, and doctrine into analytical sequence that actually answers the question I posed. He had paused, then continued. I designed that question to be challenging because I wanted to test whether congressional oversight advocacy was grounded in serious constitutional thinking or was superficial political positioning. And you've just demonstrated constitutional sophistication that exceeds what I encounter from most guests who claim constitutional expertise. The CNN control room could be heard off camera saying "wow" and making similarly impressed reactions. Apparently stunned by what they had just witnessed, Cooper had then done something unusual. I want our audience to understand what just happened here. I posed a complex constitutional question, incorporating multiple precedents and asking for synthesis that would provide actual guidance. Representative Crockett didn't just answer, she provided analytical framework that law schools teach in constitutional law courses. This is congressional testimony at a level we rarely see on television. The remainder of the CNN special proceeded with Cooper treating Crockett's analysis with evident respect for its intellectual sophistication, asking follow-up questions that built on, rather than tested her expertise. The immediate aftermath focused on how Crockett's precision had visibly stunned Anderson. Cooper, widely regarded as one of journalism's most demanding interviewers. CNN's own analysts confirmed that her constitutional framework was exceptionally sophisticated. Jeffrey Toobin, CNN's legal analyst, tweeted, "Just watched at Rep. Jasmine Crockett on @AndersonCooper provide constitutional analysis that would be impressive from Supreme Court advocate. Her synthesis of McGrath, Watkins, and Mazars into workable framework was doctoral-level constitutional law." Constitutional law professors confirmed that Crockett's framework accurately synthesized complex precedent and provided the kind of analytical guidance Cooper had asked for. Professor Lawrence Tribe stated, "Representative Crockett articulated framework for congressional investigatory authority that clarifies how broad implied power from McGrain reconciles with limiting principles from later cases." That's sophisticated constitutional thinking. The segment generated over 20 million views within 48 hours. With widespread commentary focusing on how congressional member had stunned CNN's most respected interviewer through exceptional constitutional precision. For Anderson Cooper personally, being visibly stunned by guests' intellectual sophistication was unusual experience for someone whose interviewing excellence typically meant he was most sophisticated participant in conversations. His acknowledgement that Crockett's analysis exceeded typical guest expertise reflected genuine professional respect. For CNN, having congressional testimony stunned their marquee interviewer through constitutional Sophistication represented the kind of serious journalism. The network aspired to substantive engagement with complex questions, producing genuinely impressive analysis. For Crockett, stunning CNN through precision that exceeded demanding tests demonstrated that rigorous constitutional study could enable congressional members to engage at levels that astonished even sophisticated journalists in subsequent interviews. Crockett explained that she had recognized Cooper's question as serious test, requiring comprehensive synthesis rather than simple answer. She had prepared for the possibility of such testing by developing analytical frameworks that could synthesize multiple precedents into coherent guidance. She emphasized that Cooper's visible reaction and his acknowledgement that her analysis exceeded typical expertise-validated approach of treating constitutional questions with intellectual seriousness they deserved rather than reducing them to political talking points. So if this examination of how responding to demanding journalists test with precision that exceeds what the test was designed to measure can stun interviewer, network, and audience by demonstrating constitutional expertise that serious journalism rarely encounters has shown you that rigorous preparation enables engagement at levels that impress even most sophisticated questioners. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis of moments when intellectual excellence astonishes through substance. The CNN special where Anderson Cooper tested Jasmine Crockett and her precision stunned CNN Live was more than impressive. Interview It was demonstration that congressional members who study constitutional law rigorously can provide analysis that astonishes even television journalism's most demanding interviewers. That synthesizing complex precedent into workable analytical frameworks requires intellectual sophistication that serious testing can reveal, but that typical political discourse rarely surfaces. And that sometimes the most powerful moments in journalism are when designed tests of expertise reveal that guests possess understanding exceeding what even demanding questions were calibrated to measure, leaving respected interviewers visibly stunned by encountering constitutional reasoning at levels that validate journalism's highest aspirations for substantive political discourse.